I was giving you guys a sampling of Goth music in the background. If anyone's familiar, Cure, in my opinion, one of the best English bands of all time. Next to the Smiths. Great lyrics and just they paint a picture of a different world. We're going to talk about Goth today. Not just the music, but the barbarians. It's pretty obvious it isn't all about the barbarian invasions that took down Western Rome. There was quite a bit of things going on with disintegration of that. And keep in mind that Eastern Rome carried on, of course, the Byzantium Empire, the Byzantines, located in their capital Constantinople, right across from Turkey, located in the Black Sea. So it's not just about the barbarians, but it does have a lot to do with the barbarian invasions. You know, the barbarians, some of it had to do with migration. The barbarians needed to migrate. There are many barbarian tribes that were spread out all over Europe, you know, not just Rome proper, just many barbarian migrations, and not all of them militant, or at least not all of them started as militant. When you have a bunch of starving Goths, you know, they might go to and attack your castle if you don't feed them, you know. So that is one aspect. And of course, like the documentary said, the barbarians didn't want to destroy Rome. They wanted to take part in Rome, because some barbarians, even though they were tribal leaders and they were great military leaders, Rome wouldn't necessarily promote them to it as a top general, and so that could be a problem. But on the other side of the coin, many of these top generals weren't even living in Rome anyway, and some of these barbarians were high-status commanders, or even trained by Rome. And so, make no mistake, these barbarians, many of them even knew Latin, at least in terms of the officers, not necessarily the poor followers. Because everyone has their own aristocracy. We might call them chieftains, you know, German chieftain or whatever, but, you know, they're the same as a king or what have you. So we've got different types of barbarians that are moving all over the place. We've got the Goths, is one main group. The main Goth is the Visigoth, and they're important because they are the ones who began moving into Spain. So these are all Germanic tribes over in Germanic territory. It's not called Germany yet, but we just call them Germanic tribes because that's what they are. The nation of Germany hasn't quite formed, so they're moving all over the place. The Franks moved in actually pretty much earlier than everyone else and already had settled in. The Franks, that's where we get the word for France. It's a Germanic tribe. France is named after them. And so they had actually moved in, and they're contesting with the Burgundians. Burgundians, very famous French royal household, also a German tribe. Check out England. Anglo-Saxons, the Angles, the Saxons, they move in. When we refer to somebody from England, we call them Anglo-Saxon. We don't call them Celtic. We don't call them, Pictish or what have you. They're Anglo-Saxons. That's German, right? And so even today, English royalty are German. There's a longer story to it, and it's more complex, but it's quite interesting. So we get the Visigoths coming into Spain. Now check this out. We see these invasion dates, Rome, 410, 409. Well, in 711, Islam had actually been growing for quite a while. And Islamic empires after the fall of Rome are much stronger than the barbarian tribes in general. But they're located in the Middle East, Northern Africa, and in 711, a Muslim kingdom takes over most of Spain. So between 711 and for about 700 years, Muslims will control Spain. 700 years. A lot of people don't realize that. About 700 years, Muslims controlled Spain. But it was the Visigoths that finally drove them, take credit for driving them out of Spain, much later than these migrations here. The Lombards are quite interesting because most of the history we know about them is after they settle in northern Italy, Lombardy. And it's our Carolingian and Merovingian Frankish heroes that we'll talk about today that finally drive out or weaken the Lombards because they were giving the Pope a lot of trouble. The Pope, of course, is located here in Rome. So quite interesting. All these barbarians have their own stories. The Vandals, another Germanic tribe. Ostrogoths end up, out here and basically helping form a barrier against the Huns coming in. The Huns, a Magyar-speaking group, will eventually create the nation we now know of as Hungary. They're also Finnish peoples are related to the Huns as well. They speak the same language group. Quite interesting, the Goths. These are all Germanic tribes settling all over Europe, so it'll really change things. So let's talk about the word Goth. This won't take a lot of time if you're not interested in art, history, and culture and that sort of thing. But I think it's kind of fun. The evolution of the word Goth. This process takes many hundreds of years, and it starts with the Gothic barbarians. We call these barbarians who helped sack Rome, and the Visigoths who moved into Spain and migrated as Germanic tribes all over Europe to settle. We call them Goth. They began building architecture. Now, a lot of these are already Christian before they actually sack Rome. They're already converted. But a lot of the Germanic tribes, because they weren't under direct control of Western Rome proper, Rome and Christianity, they learned a different form of Christianity known as Arianism. And if you remember back, Constantine in 325 AD at the Council of Nicaea tried to stamp out heresy of Arianism, which, if you remember, I drew the triangle on the board talking about the Trinity, how the Christ has always existed according to what Christians believe today. Well, the Arian heresy said Christ was made like kind of after the fact and sent down to earth, to be the savior for humankind. And so that was a big point of debate. And so most of these Germanic tribes were Arian, so they didn't quite meld with the doctrine of the strong Christian on the block in Europe and Spain, which is the Pope, which is the Roman Catholic Church, the West. So what's interesting, though, is that there is a Germanic tribe that, because they were in France early and had contact with the Romans early, who were not Arian, and actually their ideology of Christianity, their view of Christianity, meshed really well with that of the Pope, and that is the Franks, the one we talk about, what French would be named after them. The Franks are quite interesting, and it's the Franks who become the sort of main strong power. Charlemagne himself is a Frank, and he becomes the first Holy Roman Emperor. It's that marriage of the new barbarian power on the block with the Pope in Rome that gives that validity. And it's, of course, the Franks that do it first because they're non-Arian. They're the right type of Christianity, you might say. And so after time went on, there's all this beautiful architecture around, but is actually contrast quite a bit with Roman architecture, and we call that Gothic architecture. It's after that era of the Gothic invasions. As a matter of fact, when it was first used, it was not a compliment. Like, we have all this Gothic architecture in this part of Germany or what have you, and it wasn't necessarily a compliment. And of course, many political parties are actually sort of reappropriating an insult. So it was eventually a style of architecture. Many people are familiar with that, the flying buttresses and the ornate steeples and just a lot of detail. Pretty amazing. And then, fast forward quite a bit to the era of Romanticism in literature. And Romanticism begins after the era of the Enlightenment, after Voltaire, after Louis XIV, much closer to modern day. The Romantic movement was into the old world. It was into poetry and emotion and how you feel, because in the age of the Enlightenment, a lot of your books that were out, really people sort of overemphasized reason and logic and science. And so there was like a counter-revolution in literature that created Romanticism. And so we have many great Romantic era authors, Blake, Shelley, who we know of and we admire, who wrote a lot of poetry, became almost like rock star journalists in a way. They would send back poetry from whenever they were traveling. It would be printed in newspapers and that sort of thing. And so it became very popular. A lot more people in this post-Enlightenment era in Europe who could read and that sort of thing. And so there was a subgenre of Romanticism, and that was called Goth. And there are actually several, what we might say, stages of Gothic literature. The, of course, very first was written in 1764 by Walpole, called The Castle of Otranto. And the main idea of this subgenre of Romanticism called Goth is that it focuses on, of course, darker themes, very emotional, like the Romance era poetry and literature. But also it has references to old architecture, ruins, the old world, and also the wildness of nature. Full moons, sounds in the dark, being caught in a forest. And so you get a lot of this imagery that begins as early as the 1700s, late 1700s, that begins creating this genre that will eventually create the genres that we love today in movies of vampires, and we now have zombies that fall in love. And zombies are no longer just eating brains, they now have personalities. So it's that growth of the genre that began so long ago. And then a genre of music in the very late 70s, you get bands like Susie and the Banshee, The Cure, who began this style of music. We heard some samples from it before class began, and we heard a little bit of The Cure and Bauhaus. And of course, they're darker themes, very melodic, sometimes very dissonant. They would have, sometimes they have two strong melodies that are sort of dissonant with each other. Very based on the idea of Romanticism or even Expressionism, where you're trying to portray a specific emotion, whether it's dark or simply a shade of depression. The Cure, in particular, the bands pictured on the right, became masters of this. They were capable of a lot more than talking about ghosts and vampires, as, say, Bauhaus often did. But they got into more complex emotional content. But it's all very much based on goth. And I love this picture because it's actually in front of Gothic architecture. Then eventually it became a fashion, a literal fashion where people would set out to make Gothic fashion, not just goths trying to make their own clothing or pull together pieces to put together Gothic ensemble. You now actually have a commercial product. And then the stage we're in now, it's now a mainstream product. We have stores in the mall dedicated just to goth clothing and accessories, like Hot Topic. You go in there, tons of Gothic, probably 80% of it is Gothic, and it's kind of almost a teenage Gothic. You have cute little skulls on bracelets, it's almost an imitation of itself. So it's quite interesting, but that's what happens when you turn something into a product. It has to be very packageable and recognizable as, whatever market it's being sold in. So it's quite interesting that a word can evolve like this through these many stages.